Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Judy and I love traveling and history. Today we're going to visit Taormina, a beautiful hillside resort chock full not just of vistas and views, but also of history. We took a look at the medieval Saracen castle dating from the Muslim conquest of the island, the curious Madonna of the Rocks, and visited the ancient Greek and Roman theater last time. This time we'll take a look at the city itself, mostly clinging to the hill above the Ionian Sea, with just one really flat main street called the Corso Umberto, today on The Armchair Traveler. The Corso Umberto is the main shopping and mostly pedestrianized street here in the city. It's also the longest flat street I encountered during my visit. It stretches about a half a mile between the Messina and Catania gates. All of a day tripper's mandatory stops are within a block or two of it, as well as most of the better restaurants. Taormina draws a lot of tourists, and if the restaurant suggestions from Google are any guide, they're all rich tourists. Almost all the restaurants are rated as expensive or seriously overpriced for what you get. Flowers are on display all over the city. Those red stickered boxes behind and to the left of the flowers are actually mailboxes. This is St. Catherine of Alexandria's church, set in a square just off the main drag and facing a very popular pedestrianized shopping area, shown in the inset on the left. St. Catherine is widely venerated in both Catholic and Orthodox churches. The list of people and professions for whom she is a protector is as long as my arm, but first of all is unmarried girls, students, and dying people. That latter affiliation would explain her prominent placement in the St. John's altarpiece in St. John's Hospital in Bruges. Her story goes like this. Catherine was a very young Roman citizen who converted to Christianity and went to visit Emperor Maxentius to show him the light. Maxentius wasn't much interested, but she allegedly converted his wife, Valeria Maximilla, who would have been the stepmother to Constantine the Great. At least here we have some real people. Maxentius tried to force her to give up her faith, and when she refused to give up her faith, he had her beaten and imprisoned. He then offered her her freedom, the story goes, if she were to marry him. Since he was already married, marriage wasn't really what he was offering. She said no. Greatly annoyed, he ordered her to be executed on a breaking wheel. This was a rather hideous instrument of torture in Roman times. When Catherine was taken to the wheel, she touched it, and a miracle occurred. The wheel shattered. Unable to torture her to death, the emperor had her beheaded. The interior of St. Catherine's was far more interesting than the exterior, at least in my opinion. On the left you can see that it's a single-aisle church, with the altar and a large painting above it. Notice that timber beam ceiling. I looked, but didn't see anything that looked like a fire suppression system, nor did I even notice any fire extinguishers. On the right is a close-up of the imposing painting above the altar depicting St. Catherine's martyrdom. It's attributed to a Sicilian painter named Jacopo Vignerio from the 16th century. This statue of St. Catherine is dated 1493, so it predates the church by nearly 200 years. This is a detail from the base of the statue of St. Catherine. Notice in the center panel that the future saint is shown surrounded by Romans on either side and pictured with her emblem, a wheel. Palazzo Corvaya is a medieval building dating originally from the 10th century when the Arabs conquered the area. It has a cube-shaped tower that they used to defend the town. It is named after one of the oldest and most famous families in Taormina, who owned it from 1538 to 1945. The building remains in use to this day, suitably modernized and repurposed as the local tourist information center. I remember they were quite helpful to me, and I needed their help because I'd left my map and my walking plan back in Catania. There was a Jewish quarter here in Taormina. This was the Palazzo dei Giurati. The legend is that the Jews were brought to Taormina as slaves after the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And some likely were, but it seems more likely to me that a lot of them came voluntarily. They were educated people, and educated people, traders in Jerusalem, all spoke Greek. Since much of civilized Sicily also spoke Greek, it seems reasonable that being able to speak the language increased their chances of success. The good times didn't last, however, and today there are few traces of their presence here in the city. I know because I looked. Starting in the 14th century, Sicilian Jews endured open discrimination and in some places were even forced into ghettos. A decree was issued in 1492 ordering their expulsion. By 1493, most of Sicily's Jewish population had left the island, although about 9,000 remained and converted to Christianity. I didn't know what I was looking at when I saw the tiny Stars of David in this rather sturdy-looking building, and I couldn't read enough Italian to figure out what it was. In retrospect, this flag should have given it away. It's City Hall. This building dates to the 1700s, not to the original arrival of the Jews. Only the facade is original. At the end of World War II, the city fathers found the buildings in a completely dilapidated state. At that, it must have been still one of the sturdiest buildings in the city. Except for a few Stars of David, this is one of the few references remaining to the Jewish settlement of Taormina. Here you can see the modern security gate and a peek at the rather fancy steps leading upstairs to City Hall. Piazza of the 9th of April is Taormina's main square. This is where tourists and locals alike congregate to pass the time and enjoy the sun. On that day, Mass in the Taormina Cathedral was interrupted to announce that Garibaldi had landed in Marsala, on the far side of the island, to begin his conquest of Sicily. There are lots of fancy bars and cafes in the area and a pass-through at the bottom of the clock tower, which you can see on the left behind the fancy lamp, that opens to the medieval section of town. The Church of San Giuseppe marks one edge of the April 19th square. The church was built between the 17th and 18th centuries as the seat of the Confraternity of the Souls of Purgatory. Purgatorial societies exist to help move dead souls from an intermediate stage into heaven. I like the image not so much because of the church, but because it shows how this hillside had to have been partly leveled to provide enough space for the square and the church. Taormina was a walled city. Although the wall is mostly gone, we still could find the two city gates. This part of the city was walled as well. What is now a clock tower was originally a gate in that wall. The tower was built in the 12th century but was demolished by the French in 1676 and then rebuilt eventually as a clock. The Piazza di Duomo, or the church square, is a nice-sized square featuring the Cathedral of Taormina and a Minotaur. This is a good-sized square, although not nearly as attractive as the Piazza of April 9th. I saw a lot of people here resting and trying to cool off in that water. This is a close-up of the Minotaur that tops the fountain, which was built in 1635. It's a Baroque beauty made of marble. It sits just outside the cathedral and is also called the Four Fountains because there are four small columns supporting these basins. The fountain is topped by a Minotaur, half human and half horse, which is the emblem of the city of Taormina. It's shown here as a female. It has a crown and holds an orb and scepter, symbols of power, in its hands. This pony was one of the other beasts here in the fountain. The cathedral was the last major site on my itinerary, and to be honest, I wasn't as impressed as I should have been. I must admit it doesn't look like a lot from the outside, just a gray stone building that looked more like a fortress than a church. I found out that the oldest part dates to the 13th century. They built it on the ruins of a church that had been dedicated to St. Nicholas of Bari. It was rebuilt in the 15th, 16th, and 18th centuries. The wood ceiling of the cathedral struck me as dangerously flammable. I couldn't tell from my vantage point whether there was a fire suppression system in place or not. I certainly hope there is. This is one of the treasures of the cathedral, a Byzantine-era Madonna and Child. The icon is covered with embossed silver and enhanced with colored glass, or possibly gemstones, and what should be gold bracelets on both the Madonna and the Child's arms. I've seen many other Byzantine-style icons and even more from Russia, so I know that silver embossing is fairly common. Initially, the entire icon was painted first, and the silver was added to protect everything except the hands and face. My somewhat cynical Russian culture professor told me that later on, the only thing that was actually painted was the hands and face. In this case, you can still see the remnants of the paint for those parts of the body. This terracotta Last Supper was quite interesting. The few sources I could find suggest that the artist was named Turo Azzolino, and it dates from 2014. I remember hearing that it was somewhat controversial. The Bible tells us the names of the apostles, but as far as I know, there's no rule for seating order at the Last Supper table, although many do seem to follow the precedent set by Leonardo da Vinci. Taking Leonardo as my guide, the group on the left, looking surprised or perhaps frightened, are Bartholomew, James, the son of Alphaeus, and Andrew. The next three, starting with the man with the immense beard, are Judas Iscariot, Peter, and John. I've read that some people try to interpret that latter seated figure as Mary Magdalene on account of the long flowing hair, but if you look at the other figures, many have long locks, although I have to admit not nearly so wavy and luxurious as this one. The character was probably meant to appear androgynous, leaving room for interpretation. In the center is Jesus with his cup. When I travel, if I decide to eat out, it's generally lunch, not supper, and Taormina was no exception. I had a nice restaurant all picked out for lunch. It sounded like it would have a lot of fish. It was very highly rated on Google, and I went past it 3 times. It would have been excellent. I think I mentioned that Taormina is built into a hill, so to get off the Corso, you either have to climb up or climb down. Later on, I found another restaurant, this time downhill. There were some very narrow steps. The food was acceptable, the setting was pleasant, but it wasn't anything really special. The first course was a salad of ripe tomatoes, red onions, and mozzarella cheese. The main course was apparently meant to be linguine with clams, although that pasta looked a bit wide to count as linguine. Still, it tasted fine. Thank you for joining me on this walking tour of downtown Taormina and for lunch. I left the city as I had entered, through the Messina Gate, which leads to the big city bus station. But this is the dominant featured view of the city that will always stick with me. A fabulous view of Mount Etna, which I took from the top row of the ancient Greek theater. Fortunately for me, although the trail from the Messina Gate to the bus station went slightly downhill, there were no more steps for me to deal with. Come back next time for another city walk here on The Armchair Traveler.